myself and kind of tell you what we're going to talk about today. About me, I was a career firefighter for a decade, pretty much, in Jefferson County. Decided at one point, because all I was doing was running on an ambulance 24 hours a day, pretty much, right, making EMS runs, that I wanted to do something different. I went back to school and got a bachelor's degree in chemistry from U of L. Decided that wasn't enough school, and much to my wife's chagrin, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, so we moved up to New Hampshire, and I got my PhD at Dartmouth. Studied a lot of immunology, molecular cellular biology, cancer immunotherapy, and cancer immunology. Left Dartmouth, moved to the best city in the United States, Memphis, Tennessee. It's a joke, it was rough. Memphis, and lived in Memphis 3 years, worked at St. Jude, which is a really fantastic place to work. In Memphis. I loved it a lot, really enjoyed it, and actually we had a good time in Memphis. We liked there, but we come back to Louisville to work, be closer to some families. Our parents are getting older. And I worked for University of Louisville for a couple years with clinical trials, and then now in this last year I've been working for a private company doing clinical science. So I've been married for 15 years, wife Carmen, have a 9-year-old son, and the reason I always bring this up is not because I'm bragging or anything, is because part of what things we're going to talk about today is who you're responsible to, who you're responsible for, because everyone in this room has someone that they love or that loves them and cares about them. And part of the things we're going to talk about today is there's a lot of things individually you can do. It doesn't necessarily have to be the department as a whole has to adopt every single thing. There's going to be definitely personal responsibility that's going to have to be taken by people to decrease their exposure to carcinogens on the scene, post-fire, maybe lifestyle changes involved to decrease your chances of getting cancer. So you want to think about those people who you're responsible to and for, because I'm kind of responsible to both of them, and I'm responsible for at least him. My wife would say she's responsible for both of us, but you know, these are the people I want to go home every night and see. I want to make sure I'm healthy. I don't take anything home with me, and we'll talk about that today too, which is, you know, we think about that a lot on the EMS side and the hazmat side, but we never think about that on the fire side, about taking stuff home with us from a fire. But we do that, so that's something we want to talk about. My voice hopefully will hold up for this entire class, and I'm hoping it makes it through the next one. So why do I feel responsible? Like I said, I was a career firefighter for a decade. Was the first career group that they had in our department in Jefferson County and at Highview. Along the time while I was there were several people that came along that now are assistant chiefs and chiefs throughout Jefferson County and the city of Louisville. And one of the guys that came through was a young guy who was a high school kid. It came in through Fairdale High School, who had like this internship where they had a fire science program. And Kevin had came through and had stayed on the department, got hired after me. This is me when I was skinny back then, real skinny. So, you know, one of the things that's funny about that is that I knew Kevin for 20-some years, from him being a 17-year-old kid to becoming a major and being one of the commanding officers of the fire department. And then to see him go in a year from being completely healthy to dying from pancreatic cancer at 35 years of age is not something that any of us wanted to do. We've had firefighters die in the line of duty. We had a firefighter die in an arson fire that's still never been solved. Same year that Strawn Nutter was killed in the city of Louisville. We've had other firefighters die of heart attacks on scenes and things like that. So we feel like we pretty much have all those types of fatalities, but we never thought about having a cancer-related death, and especially someone that young. I knew Kevin well. Like I said, I know most of these guys. I still talk to them on a regular basis. And I don't do this strictly for Kevin. I do this because I don't want another Kevin. I don't want another, you know, anyone. I don't want one more male, female, doesn't matter, firefighter, it doesn't matter, EMS worker, because we're going to talk a little bit about that too, about exposures that EMS gets on scene on fire grounds too. We don't want anyone else to have to die unnecessarily when there's things we can do to prevent it. And I know your department here is actually already starting to make steps. Yesterday they gave out particulate hoods. I'm assuming they're going to give them out to you guys today. if you haven't got them already. Fantastic first step, actually a huge step to take to prevent exposure, and it's one of the major things. I'm going to give you guys enough wipes, personal wipes to use for decon at the fire scene. So how many, we got 2 trucks here this morning, or 2 engines here this morning, I should say, or 1, 2? A truck and 2 engines, okay. Well, we can divide this up however y'all want. There's 250 wipes there, so that'll last you quite a long time. They're individually wrapped, so they'll last, they don't, dry out or anything like that. So I feel responsible because I feel like I have the science background, I have the experience in the fire service, I know how we do things, and I really didn't put all this together until I started looking into this class. Like, why are we seeing such increasing levels of cancer among firefighters? Me, even after I already had a PhD, even after I had done firefighting for 10 years and knew all the things that I had done on the fire ground, I never put it together to say, why do we do that? That doesn't make any sense. Or, this is a dangerous practice that we have, but I never thought about that until I started working on this class about 2 years ago. So I really kind of want to do it just to prevent us from having another firefighter. If I do that and one firefighter doesn't die from cancer, that's all. I'm happy. I've done my job. I'm not doing it to make money or get rich, much like you guys are not doing your jobs to, get rich. Trust me, nobody becomes a firefighter to get rich. They do it because they care about the community. They care about, their fellow firefighters. They want to keep them safe. They want to do everything they can to keep, everybody happy. And we're the good guys. Let's be honest. In the public safety world, firefighters still remain to be the good guys out of everyone. We're the last to ever get complained about usually. So we want to maintain that. And there's some things we might have to change in the future when we're dealing with kids and other things like that we'll talk about as well. All right, we'll talk about how toxin-induced cancer. I'm going to go over some studies that show the actual risk of cancer in the fire service. We'll talk about how to limit by behavioral changes and some personal changes we can make in lifestyles and things like that to decrease our chances of getting cancer. And then we'll talk about gross and personal decon, which I think you guys already do to a degree, but we'll just do a quick run through of both of those. And with that, exactly 1 year to go today this came out. I was actually teaching this class a year ago today, and that night I went home and saw that they'd posted this, so this is exactly a year old today. At this point, we thought about 60% of career line of duty deaths were due to cancer. The report that looked at just the career deaths in 2016 found that 70% of those were due to cancer. And the major thing that's killing firefighters are PAHs, polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons. They are byproducts of synthetics, but mainly oil-based. Anything that's oil-based produces hydrocarbons. We know that in the fire service. Pretty much most synthetics are oil-based because all the plastics and stuff are made from an oil base itself. So a lot of the synthetics and stuff are where we're getting all of our exposure from. And this stuff is bad because it's really small and it gets in our bodies and it lasts and stays in there for a very long time. So the cool thing is we figured out some ways to prevent it from getting into our bodies, and there's some other ways we can do to mitigate that, which will actually probably lessen our chances as we go along. And then we'll talk about some preventative measures, as far as screenings that you can do, that you should do. Talk about maybe earlier screenings than we're doing right now because our chances of certain cancers are higher than the public in general. So it's just things, and I'll throw out some numbers that might scare you. And if they scare you, I'm sorry, but I want to be honest with you and want you to be aware of what we're facing. Because if we start that dialogue, then we can talk to our physicians, we can talk to, I already know that your chief officers here have bought into this and are really behind the idea of the issue of cancer in the fire service. And I've listed a couple major things I think that are like huge steps forward, and I think you guys are going to probably implement all of them. And that's making strides towards eliminating this as a problem in your department. And I know you guys have been touched by this personally here too. So over the last year, you've probably seen it's been on every news channel across the United States, Arizona, Boston. This was actually New Hampshire, close to where I used to live. And then Paul Combs, which is one of my favorite editorial cartoonists that does work for Firehouse, magazine, Fire Engineering magazine, Fire and Rescue magazine, has pretty much every month done a cancer-related editorial comic in the magazine to kind of drive home the point of the issue of cancer in the fire service, okay? So I'll just scroll through a couple that he's done. I pulled out for this year. Every one of these is about cancer. And I think that shows you what a big deal it is. The second thing I want to mention is that last year, August of last year, they had a symposium hosted by the National Fallen Firefighter Foundation in Phoenix, Arizona. It was called the Occupational Fire Cancer Alliance. And they were hoping 200 people would show up throughout the United States. They opened the window for registration in like June. The chief of my department wanted me and him to go to that. The state paid for him to go, and my department actually was not kind enough to pay for me to go because they knew that I was already working on this. Within a week, they sold out. 512 people registered. That was more rooms, and they sold out the entire thing. And they were blown away. Chief Compton was there. A lot of the major chiefs throughout the United States were there. And the thing that blew them away is that we knew this was a huge problem, but you guys have clearly shown us that it's a huge problem that everybody's aware of, because we had people from all over the United States, people from Canada, people from Europe that came to this. This is not a United States problem. This is not a Midwest problem. This is not a North America problem. This is a world problem that we're facing, because almost everywhere in the world they're using the same types of materials in homes and for most of our building purposes because it's cheaper. And those are the types of toxins we're facing. So we just have to change our paradigm of how we address that stuff. I always like to start off with a video. Boston, like I said, I was in New Hampshire for 5 years. I laughed yesterday because when I looked at my phone, Facebook sometimes does like a flashback. And I did a flashback to the last year I was there was the second time they won the World Series. And I got to go to the final game of that. My wife was nice enough to give it to me as a present for my birthday. And I got to go to that final game, and I had that on my phone of them winning the World Series. And it was really cool to be there and experience that. And then I saw that yesterday, and I thought, well, they just won it again. How crazy is that? Because they went so long without it. But I enjoyed my time in New Hampshire, spent a lot of time in Boston. The first person you always meet when you go somewhere new, if you're a firefighter, tends to be another firefighter. So my wife is a teacher, still is, teaches in Jefferson County. The first person she met teaching in Vermont was a really nice lady named Susan, and she said her husband does something for the city there. And I said, okay. So we went over for dinner one night, and I said, so Steve, what do you do? And he's like, oh, I'm the fire chief here it's White River Junction's the name of the smaller department there. And I said, oh, really? I said, I used to be, no way. So back then, we immediately made a click, because you know how the brotherhood and the sisterhood and everything is in the fire service. So I knew Steve again for years. Since then, it's been probably 15 years. He's now the chief of Burlington, Vermont, which is the only really big city in Vermont. Of their fire department, they have a population there of about 200,000 plus people. So it's a reasonable sized city, especially for Vermont. It's a large city. And I got to meet a lot of Boston firefighters through him. He was involved in the union heavily before he became chief. Boston has historically been a very aggressive fire department when it comes to tactics, when it comes to the way they address things in the fire service. Probably more old school if you think about it than a lot of other departments, but they have completely changed that paradigm of how they address, because they've had so many cancer deaths in the last 25 years that they're really changing the way they're addressing this in the fire service. So they put together a ton of videos. I would advise you, if you have a chance, to go look at them. They're called takenosmoke.org. They have an entire website dedicated to that. They have a wellness program. You can check it all out. It's really awesome. It's a Navy SEAL based VO2 max wellness program that they have for all their new firefighters to increase, basically to get them to be an elite athlete as far as physical conditioning, which is great for that portion of the job. And then they also focus on the other things related to cancer as well. it's a big deal in Boston when the commissioner and fire chief comes all the way to Phoenix to give a talk and talk about what Boston's faced, and they tear up and cry, and the union president's there because they have so many people that have passed away from cancer in the last 25 years. So that's not what I wanted to do. Let's go. Sorry, this is not my standard mouse, so sometimes it doesn't work well. So they built this wall in 2015.
I have kidney cancer.
I have brain cancer.
There's no cure for it.
I'm gonna die. And the question I asked him was, when? You're gonna know more people that die of cancer from this job than die from running into a burning building. There's so many guys that died way too young.
Before Mark passed, he told me, Rich, tell the guys, wear their face piece, clean their bunker gear. If he could do it all over again, he would.
They found a tumor the size of a grapefruit in my chest between my heart and my lung. I've been in the hospital for weeks, not only away from the fire department that I love, but away from my family that I love more than anything.
Toxins and carcinogens that are produced by fire don't care about your sense of invincibility. It's about reaching retirement and enjoying your family, because you've truly earned it.
What, burns or falling through a roof or off a roof or getting caught and trapped and burning to death. Freaking cancer, that's got me sick from it. No glory in that. Hey, look at me, no glory in that at all.
So Boston's actually changed some of the tactics they use. They now, it's a big enough deal to them, and then this wall has considerably grown since they very first built it in 2015. It now covers a complete wall at their headquarters and actually turns and starts going down another one, sadly, as the deaths continue to increase, even though, so people often ask us, so since they put all this into work several years ago, why are they not seeing an immediate decrease in cancer deaths? The problem is, and it's the same thing that I face and many of you face in this room, is who's been in here has been a firefighter for less than 5 years? Who's been a firefighter less than 10 years? All right, so very few. So I have 10 years worth of exposure. I can't take that back. I can't decrease my that exposure and do anything to actually remove that exposure. I already have that, okay? So what's happening, what we see in Boston is that there's people that have already had lifelong exposures, and they're gonna still get the cancers. What we're working on is preventing any further exposures that might be that tipping point from you going from not having cancer to having cancer. So it doesn't mean we're going to completely see an immediate stop of cancers. Now we're hopefully going to start see a trend of slowing and then a really precipitous drop in cancers among that. But it'll take a little time till we work through that to get that to happen. I'm not being a bummer, because the good news is for us that have had 10, 15 years worth of exposures, we don't have cancer yet. Every exposure we get from now on adds to our existing exposure and increases our chance of getting cancer. So by us eliminating any future exposures, we are decreasing our risk of ever developing cancer. For the newer firefighters that have 5 years or less that are new, we want to pretty much eliminate as much exposure we can for them, because there's enough danger and other things we do in the job that the toxins that we just face and we get just from the fire itself, if we can eliminate that as a danger, I think we'll see a really strong drop back down to low levels of cancer amongst firefighters. And if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to just yell out, raise your hand. I'm pretty informal. I'm going to do one little bit of science, I promise, and then we'll go more back into the firefighting. But I think this is important. I want you to understand how we get cancer and why we get cancer. And that kind of will help you understand why the things we are going to do and should do differently make sense. So we talk about the human body, we look at the average firefighter. It doesn't matter male, female, it doesn't mean the smallest one or the biggest one. It doesn't matter weight, size, any of that stuff. We have approximately 37 trillion cells in our body, okay? Whole lot of cells. 200 different cell types approximately, everything from our neurons in our brains to the epithelial cells in our lungs, to our muscle cells, you name it, cardiac cells. And they basically break down into two main kinds of cells: somatic cells, which are all those types of cells, and then we have reproductive cells. There is actually a whole area of looking at the effects of carcinogens from the fire ground on reproductive cells, whether our exposure on the fire ground is anything we might pass on through mutations in DNA to our children, if it is decreasing fertility among male and female firefighters, things like that. That study is ongoing, and we're not going to really talk about that stuff today because there's not a lot of data out yet. What we're going to talk about is all the somatic cells that are getting hit by cancer. And for the reproductive cells, it's very, very similar. There's just a couple little caveats that are different. So I always like to begin to kind of make sure we have a good common understanding of the language we're going to be talking about. So when I say cancer, I mean cancer. And by that, we often get confused. People use the word tumor very freely. A tumor can be benign, meaning that it's not cancerous, and a tumor can also be cancerous. So I prefer to use cancer or non-cancer or benign to differentiate between those. Tumors really are just growths that happen. They can be subcutaneous, but basically it's a growth of cells that goes beyond the normal growth and will often form lumps or knots. And you can get those and they can be completely benign, not dangerous. We just get them removed often because of discomfort they may cause us, or for aesthetic reasons because it's unpleasant to see a lump on, somebody's neck or shoulder or face or something like that. But these are the ones that we're not too concerned about. Rarely do these cause issues. There are certain cases where they do cause issues when they're in the brain and places like that. They can put pressure on other areas, and that drives us to a little bit more dangerous situation. The nice thing is that they're often enclosed into a sac, almost in like a cyst form, where that sac keeps everything enclosed. It doesn't move anywhere else in the body. They don't invade anything. They don't grow really fast. And a real common one that most people get is lipomas, which are fatty cysts, fatty tumors. They're kind of interchangeable. I had a firefighter that I worked with for years. He's now an assistant chief in Okolona. And he's had 2 or 3 removed from behind his leg, and he's really into bodybuilding and weightlifting, and he's had to get it done because like doing squats, it'll start to kill him where he can't bend down, and they just basically have to cut the whole thing out. I think some people are more prone to getting these types of things than others, and it's not exactly clear why. However, when I talk about cancer, we're talking about the bad stuff, okay? We're talking about malignant cancers that have the capability of moving around through the body. They don't always do, but they have that capability. They can enter the blood vessels, they can metastasize, move from site to site. A lot of times the symptoms are not initially there. You don't notice anything until you start having pain or some other secondary effect. And it might be as simple as finding a painless lump, which we'll talk about for men and women in the fire service right now. 2 of the main concerns we're looking at that have the highest rate are testicular cancer and breast cancer among women. And those are the 2 that are the biggest rate among firefighters. So again, self-exams, finding those types of painless lumps, going ahead and getting them checked out early is the key to us having a pretty good, safe, and good outcome. But these cancers, they grow fast, they have the capability to metastasize, to move, to infiltrate other parts of the body, and they're not encapsulated. There's nothing that keeps them in one location. I will tell you that this does vary greatly based on the type of cancer. Some of them are really aggressive, move to lots of different areas. Other ones, once they grow to a certain extent, they will start to move. So there is I would say there's a line of variation amongst that, but all malignant or all cancers have that capability potential to a different degree. Testicular cancer, it has one of the least amount of that ability. You can have stage 4 testicular cancer and your survival chances are like 86% still. Because the metastasis only usually goes to the abdomen. It doesn't really go into a lot of other areas, and it's really usually easy to remove, and it responds extremely well to chemotherapy. So there's kind of a range in there to be aware of too. So just don't think immediately cancer straight to death. Each one has kind of its own little caveats that can drive it. All right, so this is the little bit of science I'm going to talk about today. So this is the classical image of a cell that we've always seen. There will be a test on this later on, so please everybody take notes. So this is, we've seen this probably in your high school textbooks, college, if you went to college. We have our ER, which produces all of our proteins in our body, and they get all that information from the nucleus of the cell. Inside the nucleus, we have all of our chromosomes that make us who we are. Which is basically, the chromosomes are just our DNA that basically winds tight around these little balls called histones, and they basically pack into a spaghetti formation, form these standard chromosome features. This is what they look like per se, based on X-ray crystallography structures. Are they solid? Absolutely not. This is probably a lot more what they look like, but based on our resolution, that's kind of the basis of what we consider them to look like. Okay, so what we're really talking about is DNA, double-stranded DNA. This is what tells our body how to do everything. It tells us how to make every protein in our body. It's what gives us our hair color, our eye color, our muscle tone, our skin color, okay? We're all like 99.8, 99.9% identical. That one little 0.1% is what makes everybody unique, and the variation is just in pigmentation and skin, hair color differences, and we get those from our parents. So remember, we get half of our DNA from our mother, half from our father approximately. It can vary from like 48 to 50% per each, and then there's some random recombination that occurs as well. So we can blame our parents for only half of our problems that way. Together, I guess you can blame them for about 96%. But this DNA, what it does is it basically tells our body what to make. So making proteins. Our body makes pretty much all proteins, enzymes, everything that's used inside of it. Our body also has the capability of making all the cells we need for our immune system in our body, all the cells to regenerate tissues in our liver and our kidneys and things like that. So all that information is packed into each cell. Each cell has a complete blueprint of all that. If you printed it all out as far as the ATGC, I saw the most recent one, which you had to read with a magnifying glass, took up like 2 12-foot tall bookcases standing 6 foot wide next to each other, and it was just filled with books. So I don't know how many, probably 1 million pages that it took, but it's a lot of information. The cool thing about this is that each one of these areas encodes different proteins. So I like to use an example of actually how cancer kind of happens. So in this area here, every 3 of these base pairs that we see in our DNA encode for an amino acid, okay? 5, 7, 10, 20 amino acids make a protein, okay? Proteins can be anything from albumin that we find in our blood, which is a major component of our blood, to insulin, you name it. All kinds of different proteins that exist in our body, okay? One of the proteins, for instance, that we see a lot of are proteins that control cell growth. Our cells grow at a really controlled rate. They don't grow at an uncontrolled rate. Our cells are very regulated to say, all right, cells can grow, all right, we'll stop growing, this area has enough. And we actually have, we're much like a pitcher of tea, if you want to think about that, is that once we're full and you want to add more cells in there, there's nowhere to put it. We have to have room to add more cells in our body, and this is a well-known immunological issue that we face, and that's one reason why when we do bone marrow transplants and things like that, we have to actually make space in patients by decreasing their immune system some so we can put new cells in their body, okay? So this section, let's say for instance, I'll give you an example, is this portion of DNA right here encodes like a 20 amino acid protein, and that protein controls the ability of cells to have contact dependence, which means if, like as in this room, I do not see anybody sitting shoulder to shoulder in this room. Everybody kind of likes their personal space, right? Cells like their personal space too. They do not like to be crowded on top of each other. That's something that they naturally have. They can lose that by having mutations in that gene, and that allows them to just basically grow on top of each other, and this is one of the common things that leads to tumor formation that can be cancerous. So how does that happen? not from lightning bolts. That would probably not feel too good, but I use these as an example of DNA damage. So what happens is we have DNA damage that occurs in multiple areas across this DNA, okay? And then when it goes to encode that protein, instead of encoding the correct protein, it doesn't do that anymore. It might basically encode nothing, because instead of encoding all the way through, it'll have a message to say stop at this point. So you end up with a protein that's maybe 2 amino acids long that does nothing. Another thing that could happen is that it makes the protein do something completely different that it shouldn't do. And those are the types of things that drive cancers, okay? That's how simple it is. And DNA damage is at the root of all of it, okay? So everybody always asks, how do we get DNA damage? Free radicals drive DNA damage. So this first part, by the way, you'll be a little scared about, but I'll promise you it'll get a little bit brighter after the first part. UV light causes DNA damage. Any of this stuff where you see these little dots are called free radicals. They're basically like hand grenades for DNA. They blow the DNA apart. It has to be repaired. And hopefully it's repaired correctly. If it's not repaired correctly, this is when we end up with these mutations that cause the proteins not to function normally, okay? Air pollution, which we deal with every day. Hopefully not too many of us are getting ionizing radiation unless you're undergoing some type of therapy related to radiation, or when we get our annual x-rays at the dentist or at the doctor or something like that, you'll get a low dose amount of radiation. Smoking is another way that we get a lot of free radical damage. This is for personal habit smoking, but if you want to think about it, we also in the fire service get a lot of that from the smoke we get on the fire ground as well, okay? And then the mitochondria and the inflammation. So your mitochondria, as you get older, your metabolism slows. And one of the major things that your mitochondria and your metabolism in your body does is that it helps fight these free radicals and decrease their presence in the body. So as you get older, its capability of doing that decreases, okay? And then the final thing is that inflammation can actually drive cancer and DNA damage as well. And this was really not, even when I was in grad school, which was in the mid-2000s, was not highly accepted at that point, because people were like, how does inflammation cause cancer? And I saw people almost getting fist fights at meetings about this, because everybody has two sides, much like political disagreements. Sometimes people are very hard, there's no middle ground, this is what they believe, okay? But it's really kind of interesting and simple that inflammation by itself doesn't necessarily cause cancer. What causes cancer is chronic inflammation. Inflammation that just occurs over and over and over again. A really easy example to think about is on alcoholics that are like severe alcoholics that have cirrhosis of the liver. They drink at chronic levels. They get that scarring, healing, damaging of the liver over and over and over again. That chronic scarring and healing, scarring and healing, scarring and healing often will lead to DNA damage, okay? That sometimes, because it's so chronic and happens so frequently, it may not get repaired correctly. And that's when we have that potential to lead to cancer, okay? So that's a prime example of that. There's lots of other ways that we see that. We see similar things happen sometimes with people who have ulcerative colitis and other types of inflammatory bowel diseases and other things like that. They have an increased chance of getting of cancers in those areas. So what we usually try to do is tamper down the immune response and the inflammation to decrease their chance of getting those cancers. And it's usually pretty effective. There are also some side effects to that, but trust me, most people are happy taking a little bit of side effects. So how do we as firefighters get exposed on the fire ground? So 3 main ways. We ingest stuff because we get done putting out the fire. We're on the attack crew, we're doing rehab, and what we're going to do, we're going to get a drink. There's not a sink at the fire ground. We're not going to have time to wash our hands and our face before we eat and drink. So that, believe it or not, a lot of these carcinogens and stuff get on our skin. We can't see them. We're ingesting them in our mouth when we're eating and drinking. Absorption is one of the other major ones. I would say this is probably the second major source of the way that carcinogens get in our body. A lot of these toxins are extremely small and can go straight through our skin. So the classic idea of us coming out with soot on our faces and all that, That's carcinogens, and they can just move straight across our epidermis. They don't have to have cuts or anything to get through our skin. They're that small that they can just basically go through our skin. The number one way that we're getting it in our body is through inhalation, okay? I know we wear SCBAs, but it's not common practice for everybody to use SCBAs during overhaul. And it never has. What often we did, and most departments have done for the last 15 plus years, is we use multi-gas meters to say, okay, the air quality, the CO2, the cyanide levels are low enough where the air quality is safe here. We can take off our air packs. We can do overhaul, which is an exhausting thing to do, especially wearing an air pack and full turnout gear. We take that off and then do overhaul. The problem is that we just recently found out that most materials in a house after the house is put out are off-gassing toxins for hours after that. So that entire time of overhaul, we're walking into a hazmat style scenario and we're just breathing all that stuff in. We're getting it all over us, getting it in our clothes and stuff like that, and we're just not aware of it. All right. I told you this first part's a little bit of a bummer. So I often get asked at this point, why does not everyone on earth have cancer? Because we're exposed, even the average person is exposed to all this stuff daily. On the ride over here, there was a little bit of sun. I drove through the city with my windows down. I don't think I hit any radiation today, hopefully not. But you come across a lot of this stuff on a daily basis. So, the really beneficial thing we have is that our body has multiple ways of protecting us from this, okay? One of the things I really like to talk about is what we call the multi-hit hypothesis. This was discovered about 20 years ago, and it's progressed a little bit over time. Originally, it was thought to be, it took a couple mutations to get to a cancer cell. So basically, when we talk about a mutation, we're talking about a DNA damage that occurs and does not get fixed correctly. So instead of the DNA going back to normal, something wrong gets put in there and it changes that function of that protein. Okay, that's what we talked about earlier. So the nice thing is that these single mutations that happen on occasion, not a big deal. There's pathways in between here that have regulatory action that can actually stop that. A second mutation that occurs due to DNA damage, again, not a big deal. We have pathways in here that can correct that, get rid of these cells, and we're okay. Third mutations often are not sufficient to do anything, and we have pathways in here to correct this. Fourth mutations sometimes are enough to lead to a malignant cell, one cancer cell. And then from that cancer cell, every other cell grows as a basic exact copy of that one cancer cell, okay? So there's lots of steps here where we have regulation and protection, and a lot of things had to happen to an individual cell for it to become cancerous. So that's the first benefit we have, is that it takes a lot of things to a specific cell to cause it to become cancerous. The other really nice thing we have is that one of the things that our body does naturally is it does cause DNA damage naturally. When we get cut, when we get infections, our body produces like pus, okay? Pus is made from the neutrophils in our innate immune system. It's a way of cleaning out cuts and wounds, getting rid of bacteria, viruses, things like that. It's actually called myeloperoxidase is what it is, because it's like a high, strong form of hydrogen peroxide. But it actually damages DNA because that's, as it cleans out, it does also damage the DNA as well. So our body has developed mechanisms to repair DNA damage when that happens. We benefit from that when we have these exogenous agents or outside sources of DNA damage happen. So smoke, radiation, heavy metals, not the bands, but like cadmium, lead, things like that can lead to cancer. Viruses and other types of genotoxins or anything that's toxic and then causes damage to your genes, okay? These all can result in DNA damage, and the really nice thing is that we have lots of pathways that protect us from DNA damage, because what their main job is to do is go and repair that DNA damage. When that stuff gets blown apart, they come in and put it back together, and they're pretty darn good at doing it. We're talking one mistake every million base pairs, okay? So their ability to put it back together and not make errors is very, very high. So When an error does happen, though, the even nicer thing to do is, guess what? It also has a secondary way to go back and fix that. So it has a mismatch repair system. So there's a lot of redundancy in here when things don't match up. And our body can tell that through different mechanisms that, yeah, we put the wrong nucleotide in there, we can fix that and we can move. So basically, I want you to think about this is that we have lots of redundant mechanisms in here to protect us from this DNA damage that we might actually be exposed to. And all of those have to kind of fail for us to progress to one cancer cell, okay? So once we get to that one cancer cell, that's when we have that potential to develop a cancer, okay? My favorite portion of this, because I'm an immunologist, yeah, you can move it wherever you like, is I like to talk about the immune system. The immune system is probably one of the major things that protects us on a daily basis against cancer, and we don't talk about it a lot, but it's really important. So this is a great slide that they put out showing how the immune system monitors the body continuously. This is what it does. We have approximately anywhere from 100,000, depending on how healthy you are, to up to 1 million cells of T cells per teaspoon of blood. These T cells' only job is to survey our bodies looking for things like infection, viruses, foreign materials, things like that. Well, they also look for cancers, okay? And I do this analogy. I'm a U of L fan, so I will tell you that. It's been a tough year for U of L football, but based on the colors of the cells, I just use this as an analogy. The T cells in this case are UK because they're blue, okay? So they recognize all other cells that have that UK blue flag sticking up and saying, hey, we're UK, okay? We belong here. When they come across these cancer cells that are red, that hold up maybe a U of L, or IU, whatever other team is red, sign and say, hey, I don't belong here. They recognize that and they begin to attack and kill that cell. Okay? After that happens, another cell comes along. We call it a dendritic cell, which is based on a Latin name called dendrite, which is another word for arms, because it has all these little arms that reach out and picks up these pieces of the dead cells. We call them antigens, and it goes back to your lymph nodes and takes it and shows it to all the other. Imagine this is the lymph node right here. It would come in and say, okay, this is what we got. Who in this room is capable of going and killing this, okay, based on this? And all of our cells have such a diverse repertoire of what they can attack and kill. Certain cells are going to say, we can do that. And everybody's experienced this, because when you get an infection and your lymph nodes swell, that's actually what's happening, is that you've got migration of cells to your lymph nodes. Lymph, which is a liquid that actually helps bring those cells there. You're enlarging, you're getting a lot of cells activated in there, and they're getting primed to go out and kill whatever the toxin you might be facing, whether it's simple as a bacteria, a virus, or a cancer cell. So these cells get activated, they get excited, they go out there and they start killing. Each one of these active T cells that are a killer T cell can kill about 100 cancer cells by itself before it starts to get tired. And they do get exhausted after that. And that's a common thing we use. But the nice thing is that there's so many of them that can respond that it's usually highly effective at getting rid of the tumor cells. I'll give you a prime example of this, and I give this every day, so if you've heard this before, I'm sorry, you're going to hear it again today. I had a professor at Dartmouth named Elmer Pfefferkorn. You can look it up. It's not a made-up name. He's really a professor at Dartmouth. He's like 186 years old and about 5 foot tall. Fantastic guy, still sharp as a whip. He's not an active physician anymore, but he teaches still grad students. Unbelievable guy. If I ever had a question that I could answer, that'd be my phone a friend, is that who that guy would be. So I went into a class. I was older, like I said, I have a 10-year on the fire service. I went back to school. After that, I went through undergraduate, and then I went to graduate school. So I was quite a bit older than the next oldest person that was in grad school. There's about 100 of us sitting in this auditorium. He comes in, and we're having a discussion about cancer and the immune system. And one of the things that is said is, there's about 100 of you in this auditorium right now. About 10 of you have cancer in your body right now. Well, for all those 20-year-olds, they're all looking around. They look at me because they're like, well, that's the old guy. That's the one who has it, okay? And he said, it doesn't matter about age. He said, what happens is that our body constantly has one or two little cells that maybe have cancerous capabilities, okay? But our body eliminates them through these natural processes that we go through, all these different steps along the way that protect us. And our body gets rid of them before it ever becomes a problem. And that's one of the benefits of having a strong immune system and having, a healthy lifestyle and maintaining your immune system really strong, because that's what it does. That's the whole purpose of that. And this wasn't appreciated a lot until the 90s. They actually kind of figured this out in the 80s, but they didn't know what they were looking at. So now you're going to get a little bloodborne pathogen action at the same time. So in 1980s, what hit the United States and pretty much threw off all physicians and doctors?
HIV.
Exactly, HIV and AIDS, okay? Common thing that happens is, what does AIDS target? Immune system, specifically CD4 T cells, okay? So what was happening is they were getting all these AIDS, HIV patients into hospitals. They were advancing to AIDS, which is the progressive, where they start to get a lot of cancers, a lot of other disorders that are not very common. And a lot of these AIDS patients were getting really rare cancers, like 1 in a million cancers. But lots of them were getting the same cancer. And the physicians were just blown away. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense why they're getting these really rare cancers. And a lot of them are getting the same cancer. When we see this at 1 in a million in the general population, they have something is there that's causing for this specific population to develop these cancers. Well, it wasn't until the 90s that they kind of put it together that what actually is happening is, when you get HIV, like you said, your immune system completely drops, okay? You go from the capability of having hundreds of thousands of T cells per teaspoon of blood down to 1 to 10 T cells per teaspoon of blood. Your count is really low. It makes you really susceptible to lots of things, which is what usually kills an AIDS patient, is that they get infections or secondary things that happen and their body cannot fight it off. The same thing was happening there, is that these T cells actively were probably getting rid of these rare cancers on a normal basis, and they just never appear in our bodies because our bodies are taking care of them, without us knowing. But when you completely get rid of the immune system for a long period of time, those cancers were having the capability to grow out, okay? And it wasn't appreciated till then, and the major role that played in there. And in the 80s to the early 90s, this whole idea of tumor immunology, the role of the immune system in fighting cancer, believe it or not, there were people that laughed at that and thought it was pseudoscience. Luckily, in the last 20 years plus, the technology has came about where we can show that it's not a joke. Actually, some of the most, and we'll talk about this later on, some of the most effective cancer therapies right now have to do with enhancing the immune system in a patient, and we're talking at really, really successful treatments that are saving lots and lots of lives. So that's kind of the importance of our immune system and how it kind of protects us on a daily basis. All right, this is what one of the killer T cells looks like here in green. This is a electromicrograph reconstruction, and we basically, as scientists, we get bored sometimes, so we like to do really cool stuff like make cells different colors. So we have all these ways to make the surface of the cell green, different parts of the cells blue and red, and different things like that. And these are cancer cells, so these are probably, I would say, HeLa cells. In red, the blue part is the nucleus of the cell, and this green cell is a T cell. And this is all happening inside of like a petri dish type of container, and we do live 24-hour, they grow in like a controlled container, and they move around. The T cells, we put those in there, we have everything ready to go, and we film this for 24 hours through a microscope, and we watch what happens. And I can show you this video. I like to only show it because the lady has a British accent, and it makes me seem like I have a little bit more authority than I actually do. And plus it gives, everybody likes to listen to British accents. But basically what happens in this video is that you see this green T cell going around to every one of these cancer cells. It comes up to it, it grabs it basically with the surface of the cell, it opens up the membrane, and that orangey yellow thing is a cytotoxic granular that it jams inside that T cell, okay? It closes back up the surface of that cell, it goes to the next one, does the same thing. And it does it over and over, and that's how they kill the cells. They're basically poisoning them because it's recognizing it doesn't have that right flag. It doesn't belong there, okay? And like I said, this can do up to 100 cells, and then they would go into a state sometimes called exhaustion or anergy, where they can die. Sometimes they'll actually then become a different type of cell that lasts long periods of time and can respond later on if this ever reappears. All right, so I've showed you all the great stuff that our body can do, and then we're going to get back to the problem. The problem we face is that firefighters, much more than the average public, have chronic repeated exposure to carcinogens. Even for people who smoke on a daily basis, that we still have, our exposures are so much higher than those people, okay? And we face really dangerous carcinogens and particulate matter on the fire ground. One of the most dangerous things we do right now is failure to use our SCBAs during overhaul. And like I said, we were not aware of this till recently, that there's so much toxic off-gassing that occurs during overhaul. And trust me, I'm one of the people, I'm guilty of everything, by the way, we're going to talk about today. So I'm not pointing fingers at anyone in this room, because I've done every single thing wrong. And only till like the last year or two that I start thinking about this stuff and like, man, why did we do that? And we just never have thought about it before. But we do things like that because it's just, let's think about it. When we're doing overhaul, we're usually exhausted. Depending on how many trucks and engine companies you get to respond, you might have the same crew doing multiple tasks, fire attack and maybe overhaul. For us, that was a common scenario. Trust me, I'm ready to drop my turnout code and my SCBA, because my back's already killing me, and then now I've got to start pulling ceilings and looking for extension and things like that. So I understand that kind of need for that, but it's one of the things that's probably giving us the highest risk of danger that we're facing right now in the fire service. All right, so where's our evidence for increased risk? And I'll give you guys a break every hour or two, so don't worry. Where's our increased chance of risk? Well, sadly, we did not know about this increased chance of risk in the fire service until after 9/11. The only reason we do know about it is because of 9/11. This is stolen from Anderson Cooper in the mid-2000s. What happened was all these firefighters that worked at Ground Zero started getting multiple conditions. The first conditions they got were similar to what we saw in the first Gulf War. For you younger people, that's the original one in the 90s. We had something called Gulf War Syndrome, where people were exposed to heavy metal, spent uranium shells. They got neurotoxin disorders, and lots of things were happening. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. Once they realized later on that what they were being exposed to, these people were getting nervous system deterioration, MS-type symptoms, really multi-organ issues due to heavy metal exposure. Okay, and they saw a small bunch of firefighters from 9/11 and first responders from 9/11 that had the same types of symptoms. The second wave came as they started getting cancers. So in the second wave, when they started getting cancers, the first question was asked was, all right, well, we need to determine if this is due strictly to 9/11 or if this is an occupational thing. So the obvious question they ask is, what's the normal rate of cancer amongst firefighters? No one knew. There was no research done. If you start looking back, the first major report that we'll talk about is what we call a meta-analysis, where they took 32 really small studies and put them together to make the first big study looking at cancer in the fire service. Again, completely off the radar until after this, and it all came about as a reactive response to something that had already happened. And we're trying to, as a fire department and the fire service as a whole, we're trying to move away from the reactive portion of this. And I'm really happy to be in Jeffersonville today, because I feel like they're taking a very proactive stance on a lot of this, which is fantastic. And that's what we need to do. I don't want us to be reactive anymore, because when we're reactive, it's too late to address a lot of these issues. Okay, so nobody had any idea. We knew what happened at Ground Zero. The Zadroga Act got passed. There was a way to capture all the first responders that responded to 9/11, keep track of the number of deaths, cumulative. So like in 2016, we're at 4,700 first responders had died of cancer related to 9/11. 2017, we had approximately 6,000 living with cancer. And when I say that, that's just not firefighters. That's firefighters, the 15,000 different police departments in New York that were involved, federal agents, National Guard, anybody that responded there as part of that first response is counted in that. The only group I believe that's not counted in that is the construction workers, okay? which is kind of sad because they were still exposed, but I don't believe they're covered in that. There's been some discussion about that recently, if I'm not mistaken. So the Droga Act got passed. The whole purpose behind this was the first time the federal government said, we're going to provide some assistance for firefighters who got cancer based on this single incident alone, okay? But it was a kind of a groundbreaking event because it opened the idea that firefighters could get cancer from incidents, and that first responders were susceptible to this, and that we needed to be aware of that and think of ways of addressing it. So, of course, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of research out, and this is actually one of the later reports, but I like to throw it out because, first, because it's interesting because of the problems they first encountered. So, of course, scientists and firefighters probably talked. I wasn't there, so I can only assume the types of discussions they had, but I would assume that it would be, scientists said, what is the most dangerous conditions you guys face? And we would have said live fire operations. That's when we have the most toxins, and where the smoke's the deadliest, the heat. That's our biggest danger we face right now on the job. Scientists probably said, well, that's where we want to do all of our measurements at, because that's where everything's going to be the highest at. Downside was two things. First of all, who's going to want to take an untrained scientist into an actual fire with them? We're not talking about a training scenario fire. We're talking about an actual live fire at someone's, at a business, at someone's home or something. Second of all, none of the equipment could withstand the temperature and the heat of that to take the necessary measurements, okay? So that didn't work out so well in the beginning. So they tried a couple of different scenarios that didn't work out. What they were able to do is finally they did some looking at overhaul, which is a lot safer to bring people in during and take measurements during overhaul. That's what they did. This was done by Oregon State Governor's Office for Air Monitoring. They just basically looked at a couple different breakdowns. They looked at it, what exceeded our ideal H levels, what was present or above OSHA short-term exposure limits, and what was present or above OSHA time-weighted average. So basically for the period that you're in overhaul, what materials are you exposed to greater than what you're allowed to based on Oregon's OSHA regulations. So you can look across here, you can see everything from asphyxiants and carcinogens to poisons and heavy metals across the board for everything, okay? And this is during overhaul. This is when we probably are often using our multi-gas meters that say it's safe, we're dropping our mask, and we're wandering around in this stuff, okay? So let's knock out the things that we often look for. Carbon monoxide, is one of the big. Hydrogen cyanide is another one we often look at in a multi-gas meter. Trying to think what else some of the other multi-gas meters will do. Maybe nitrogen dioxide, different things like that. We don't look for things like arsenic in the air. We don't look for things like glutaraldehyde. We don't look for heavy metals in the air. So even though when our multi-gas meter tells us it's safe, it doesn't tell us that these other things are not in the air. And this final sentence, which I got to underline, was the first mention of this, and this is what actually we're facing the most danger from right now, is particulate matter. Otherwise undifferentiated, less than 10 microns in diameter, okay? Particulate matter, everybody's seen it. If you come